Welcome to AP World History. We're taking a look at Latin America in Chapter 32. Latin America has had a long history of civil unrest. If you remember when we were talking about colonialism, by the end of the 19th century, almost every colonial power has been kicked out of Latin America, Central and South America. But problems still exist and existed then. There were reforms that were attempted, uh, and then there were periods where they lapsed, where people suffered from actions of the government. One of the big problems in Latin America is poverty. The haves and the have-nots, and this has created some problems. The people with the power and the money aren't willing to give up those positions to the poor. And you have a large agrarian population, not too much industry. I would consider these countries in Latin America, for the most part, dependent countries. Mexico has been making some strides in terms of industrialization simply because of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization it signed with Canada and the United States. But it still suffers. Many people flee Mexico to the United States looking for jobs. One of the other things that we can look to in Latin America is revolutions, government changes. Certainly, Latin America is torn between two worlds: the Western world, the industrialized world, and what we used to call the third world, or the undeveloped countries. Uh, to this date, there are still a lot of social injustices taking place. This has been an issue since the colonial period. Um, you have large populations, many of them trying to better themselves, going to the cities, which have created slums. Um, in terms of economic and political change, if you look over the history of it, there have been some improvements, but for the most part, little change has occurred. Educational social services almost non-existent in some of these Latin American countries. Limited education, women's rights certainly has improved, and some industry has improved. If we look to our neighbors to the south, Mexico, and we also look to Brazil, uh, they have been somewhat more successful in industrialization. Brazil has a thriving steel industry. They're an exporter of uh, natural or oil, those kinds of things. They are pretty much self-sufficient in terms of fossil fuels. They do make things for the United States and other Western industrial nations. Mexico, certainly, if you've been to Mexico, you've seen the poverty that exists in every large city that you visit. A real difference between the rich and the poor. Very few at the top in terms of wealth, and lots and lots of people at the bottom end of the scale. Mexico has been ruled since the revolution by the PRI, the Party of Industrial Institutionalized Revolution, that comes out to PRI, and it has promised reforms but seldom delivered. Uh, it eventually is going to be challenged by Zapatistas, uh, who were Indians rebelling in Central America, Central Mexico against the authorities in the southern part of Mexico. And this did bring about a movement towards change, but certainly one of the reasons Zapatistas revolted was because of the corruption in the PRI, and their brutal repression of the Indians who were being discriminated against. NAFTA comes along, the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement, and this has helped Mexico in terms of providing more jobs for Mexicans. Uh, the PRI, the Conservative Party is eventually going to change leadership there, but it's a little unclear as to which direction Mexico will be dealing. There's a tremendous drug trade in Mexico, violence, corruption. Millions of Mexicans have fled to the United States and to seek a new life. Many of these have been rounded up as they come across the border and return to Mexico, similar to what Mexico does to Guatemalan and others who are fleeing to Mexico. So there's sort of a chain reaction, different countries in South America moving north, trying to find a better life. Guatemala is certainly an interesting story. It Their leader eventually is going to try to institute some land reforms. The United Fruit Company was a huge company owned by American entities, and they wanted to redistribute the land in Guatemala. They were embracing some of the Marxist ideas. The American government helped bring down the legitimate government of Guatemala because of the movement to redistribute land to the peasants, which would have helped the people living in the country to have acres to grow their own. General Arbenez, Jacobo, he's pro-socialist, and the American government, with the help of the CIA, through the CIA and others, will help bring down his government. He will resign. We were very fearful that the communists might take over, and then the domino effect would strike Central America. So Arbenez is replaced by a very militaristic government that is pro-West and very dictatorial and repressive. And certainly many of the people in Guatemala are going to suffer by a corrupt government that we supported. Batista in Cuba rose to power. He ruled for about 25 years. He eventually is going to be replaced by Fidel Castro, in the late 1950s. One of the reasons that we stopped supporting Batista is that because of this corrupt government. I think we came to regret the day that we didn't try to keep him in power, because when Fidel Castro comes to power, he will turn to communists. Che Guevara, he joins up after an unsuccessful military takeover, a revolution in 1953, flees to Mexico. He will return in 1956 and lead a revolution that will unseat Batista. And eventually he will turn to communism. Cuba is still a communist country today. We've had an unsettled relationship with Cuba. Shortly after Cuba turned to Fidel Castro, they will lean towards the communist. Under Eisenhower, the CIA trained some ex-Cuban nationalists, patriots who had fled to Florida. They trained them, and then we're going to return them to start a revolution in Cuba and unseat Castro. When Kennedy becomes president in 1963, these expatriates, exiles from Cuba will lead an invasion of the Bay of Pigs, which will be a fiasco. They'll be slaughtered. We actually tried to have Castro executed. The CIA hitmen down there, but that was unsuccessful. In 1962, there will be something called the Cuban Missile Crisis that hits Cuba, at least for the United States, because Castro has turned to the Soviet Union for help. They will put missiles, nuclear-headed missiles in Cuba aimed at the United States. Kennedy sees this as unacceptable. He puts a quarantine on Cuba, doesn't allow any more ships to come in, and it demands that the missiles be removed. For 13 days, it looked like the United States was probably going to go to war with the Soviet Union. In the end, through back channel negotiations, the Cubans, the Castro, and the Moscow, Nikita Khrushchev, will agree to remove the missiles, and we agree to remove some missiles in Turkey. And this crisis is averted. In fact, after this Cuban Missile Crisis, relations seem to improve somewhat with the Soviet Union. But nonetheless, we came very close to a nuclear holocaust. In Nicaragua, the Sandinistas, we have supported the Contra there. They were a communist government. We oppose communists any place in Central and South America. We supplied the Contra with weapons. Eventually, the Sandinistas will be overthrown. Cuba sent troops to Grenada in the Caribbean, but we sent troops to Grenada and removed the Cuban insurgents. So we've had a history of intervening in Latin America. Another thing that comes into the 1970s is what they call liberation theology. This was a mixture of the Catholic charitable theology and Marxist socialism. It never really caught on. The Pope denounced it as being too radical. And several clergymen who supported this idea are going to be assassinated, particularly in El Salvador in 1980, a priest named Romero. And so we've kept a close eye on the countries in Latin America, trying to prevent communists from taking over at whatever means. And sometimes we have supported corrupt governments who are pro-United States, but nonetheless repressive to the people. For the most part, when you look at governments in Latin America and South America, they tend to be more dictatorial. And we'll stop there and we'll pick this up next time.